Hi, everyone. I'm excited to share with you a little bit about the life and science that happens at the South Pole. So, this video is targeted towards all age groups. There's not too much science in this, so feel free to show it to anybody. And a lot of what I'll talk about is more lighthearted material, like what it's like to live in Antarctica. So, just a little bit about my background. So, I went to high school in Texas, and all throughout, I enjoyed science, and I was really passionate about weather in particular, especially uh, trying to figure out how to predict weather, which, uh, go figure, led me to college where I majored in meteorology or atmospheric science, the study of our weather and our atmosphere. Um, and I also minored in math and geology. And that's important because in geology, I was introduced to climate. And climate is the long term weather for any place on Earth. And so when we talk about climate change, we're talking about how the long term weather at any place on Earth is changing. And so that kind of led me to be interested in not so much weather anymore, but more about how do we know the climate has changed and how is the climate going to change in the future. So I ended up in graduate school at the University of California in Irvine, where I did my PhD in Earth System Science. So, Earth System Science is kind of a weird name, but it's also a really unique program, in that we study the Earth as one system. Although the Earth has many different parts to it, right? We have the atmosphere, the ocean, the land, and now we have humans as well. But all of those components make up the Earth as we know it. So when we're trying to study climate change, we can't just look at the atmosphere alone. We have to look at all of those parts together because that's actually what's happening in our actual Earth system. So I graduated from UC Irvine back in May of 2019. I moved out to Colorado. I'm living in Boulder now, and I work at NOAA. So NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's a federal agency tasked with studying the health of our atmosphere and our ocean. So we make measurements of what's in our ocean and our atmosphere through time all around the world so that we can monitor how, one, human activities are impacting our atmosphere and our ocean, but two, also how natural things like fires impact our atmosphere and our ocean. Because it's important for us to know what's in our air, right? Because we all breathe it and we all need clean air to grow our crops and to have healthy food. So it's important for everybody on the planet to know what's in our atmosphere. So out here at NOAA, I'm studying ozone depleting gases and how they are changing through time by natural processes, such as through fires. And I'm happy to do a video a little bit about that research later on if anybody is interested in that. Also, please write down any questions you have and send them to me. I'm more than happy to make some presentations that are targeted more towards specific questions. Like if you want to know about like how much do we know about climate change or anything like that, I'm more than happy to do that in my spare time now that I'm working from home. So what do I do? I'm a scientist, and I am very interested in the Earth system aspect of our planet. How does our atmosphere interact with our oceans, and how do our oceans interact with our land? And for me, to a lesser extent, how humans are impacting our atmosphere and our climate. I'm more interested in how the natural processes, like these fires that were raging in Australia, what were they putting into our atmosphere, and how is that going to impact our ozone hole and stuff like that. So I'm an atmospheric chemist by training, although I will never uh, claim I am an atmospheric chemist. And I'm also particularly interested in climate change and educating others on climate change, why it matters, why we need to be acting now and not in 10 years, and stuff like that. So here I am at the South Pole. I'm actually standing. If you see, my hand is on a cylinder. That cylinder is an ice core. And that ice core, I'll talk exactly about what ice cores are in a second, but it's basically a sample of an ice sheet. And that ice that my hand is on is about 30,000 years old. And so, why was I holding that ice? And what exactly do we do with that ice? I'll talk to you a little bit about that in the coming slides. So, I study the past climate through information in the ice sheets. That's more of what I've done in the past at UC Irvine, but I'm still very much interested in that research. So, what are ice sheets and where are they? So, ice sheets are thick masses of ice that are on top of land. So, in order to get an ice sheet, you have to have two factors. First being it has to be cold enough that when you have snow, it doesn't melt away so that you can build up this ice mass. And also, you need to have land underneath you. And so, the two places on Earth right now where we have ice sheets are Greenland, there on the left, and Antarctica, there on the right. So, there's a lot of misconception and confusion. People think the North Pole is an ice sheet. The North Pole is actually an ocean that during the wintertime freezes over and you get sea ice there. So, there's no land at the North Pole. It's all ocean. So the only places on Earth where we have ice sheets are Greenland and Antarctica. And so for reference, together the polar ice sheets contain about 68% of the fresh water on Earth. So if these places start to melt, that water ends up going into our oceans, which then causes sea level rise, which is something we are actually seeing right now. And I'll talk about that in another video if anybody's interested. But so what is an ice core? So ice cores, there's a picture of one there on the bottom right. These are cylinders of ice that are drilled from the ice sheets and glaciers. So mountain glaciers high up in, say, the Himalayas or even the Rocky Mountains, for example. Glaciers are just ice masses that form and they don't melt away each season in the summer. So we go to Greenland and Antarctica and we basically drill into the ice sheet and we pull up these samples, these cylinders of ice sheet, and we call them ice cores. And they're interesting because they are the snapshot of the past climate. So you can imagine that there's always been snow because it's been pretty cold on our climate, especially over Antarctica for a long time. That snow hasn't melted away, and that snow has properties about it. Say it's water, but it also has chemicals and particles in that snow. And so we can look at the chemicals and particles in our ice core and kind of learn about what was happening in our atmosphere and our climate system through time. So the layers in the ice are from the yearly snowfall, as I mentioned. And right now, our oldest ice cores date back about 800,000 years. So we have 800,000 years of climate records. And recently, there has been a push to find ice that's much older than that. So say about 2.5 million years old. That ice hasn't been processed yet, so we don't have a lot of climate data from it. But we do believe that there's ice in Antarctica that is over 1 million years old. So the moving atmosphere carries environmental evidence to our polar ice sheets. And when we collect our ice core samples, we can investigate what environmental evidence there was through time. So as I mentioned earlier, you have snow falling over Greenland and Antarctica. And at the top of our snow surface, that snow is pretty light and fluffy because there hasn't been a lot of weight pushed on it from anything above. But year after year, as that snow doesn't melt away and you get more snow falling on top of the previous year's snowfall, that snow starts to compress. Just like if you were to take some snow and make a snowball or a snowman, you're compressing that snow together. And as you compress the snow together, you start to remove the amount of open space between the ice crystals. And eventually, those ice crystals get completely tight and you trap little air bubbles inside the ice crystals. So, polar ice, our ice from Greenland and Antarctica, as well as our mountain glaciers, contain trapped air bubbles of ancient atmospheric air. And so that is what's really unique about our polar ice sheets. And that's why we spend so much money to go down there to drill ice cores, is because the ice down there contains a record of what was in our atmosphere through the last 800,000 to 2.5 million years. And so that's really great. But the snow, as I mentioned, also contains water, chemicals, and particles. And so there's an abundance, a lot of stuff we can learn by investigating and doing scientific measurements and analyses on our ice cores. So my question is, what are some pieces of climate evidence that can get trapped in the snow or ice? So there's a lot of things that get trapped in the snow and ice because anything you put in the atmosphere comes out eventually. So one thing that people think about a lot are volcanic eruptions. So volcanoes erupt a lot of gas. They also erupt a lot of soot and particles, and all that stuff goes way high in our atmosphere and gets mixed and eventually lands and settles on our polar ice sheets. And so we can look at ash layers. We can also look at biology, such as bacteria. So again, in our air right now, there's bacteria. Some of it is good and some of it is not so good. That's why many of us are working from home right now. I guess that's a virus, not bacteria. But either way, stuff that maybe we don't want to be inhaling. But either way, biology. So we can look at bacteria and how it's evolved through time by measuring the amount of bacteria in our ice cores. We can also look at the chemistry of the atmosphere by looking at aerosols, which are solid particles in the air. And there's aerosols in our air right now. They're not hard, they're not bad for you. Some are, but some aren't. What I was interested in are gases. So in those air bubbles, it's basically like taking a little vial of the air through time. And right now, we're really interested in the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, as well as the amount of methane in our atmosphere. And so we can look at the amount of methane and carbon dioxide in the ice core air bubbles to get a record of what the atmosphere was like before humans started kind of putting stuff in the atmosphere. And there's many, many more measurements that are made on ice cores, and I'm not going to get into them. If you have questions about some of those measurements, I'm happy to try to answer them, or I know many people that would be happy to answer them for you. So the first thing that we do with the ice core is we have to know how old it is, right? So I keep talking about how, it's 800,000 years, et cetera, but you actually have to know at what depth you are in the ice core to what age that corresponds to. So the first way to do that is by layer counting. So similar to a tree ring, which many of you may have seen, ice cores have layers. And the layers result from the different chemical properties of the snow that falls between winter and summer periods. And so here's a picture, and this is a little outdated of a slide. This should be from the National Science Foundation's Ice Core Facility, previously known as the National Ice Core Lab. But this picture shows you a Greenland ice core, and you can see the layers in there. And on the bottom is a picture I've taken while I was at the ice core facility, and you can see those layers as well. So you can we count the layers in the ice, and that gives us a sense of how many years back we are. Also, we can use the volcanic layers in the ice. So like I said, we can see soot and ash from volcanic eruptions through time. And that can give us kind of a point in time that we kind of know of, because we have historical records of volcanic eruptions for many, many years. And so we can tie that layer to a certain age. So here on the left is a picture of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet Divide, also known as WAIS Divide, the ice core. And you can see a very thick ash layer there that's dated to about 21,000 years ago. And then on the right is a very thin ash layer that I was able to observe when I was in the field at South Pole from our ice core that dates back to about 3,500 years ago. So we can use the volcanic layers to get a sense of how old the ice is. And so now I just want to quickly talk about some of the ice core records of greenhouse gases that we have in the that we have from ice cores. And so there's a lot going on, so let's break it down. So the first thing I want to point out are there's three colors here. The first color is the blue line, which is the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere through time. So you can see it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. The red line is the amount of methane in the atmosphere through time. Again, it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And then the black line, I'm not going to talk about so much, but it's the temperature anomaly or the temperature difference over Antarctica. And that's measured with some other measurements, not through gas measurements. So I'm not going to talk too much about that right now. But what I want to draw your attention to is the time scale of these records. So on the bottom axis, the horizontal axis, is the age of the ice core. So on the left, we're looking at 800,000 years ago, moving forward by 50,000 year increments all the way to zero, or present day, which is in ice core lingo, is actually 1950 CE. So you can see that if we start on the left and we look at carbon dioxide was low, it goes up really fast, it kind of comes down again pretty slowly, it goes up, it goes back down, it goes up, it goes up, and it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. But if you look at the methane and the CO2, the carbon dioxide records together, you see that they behave in a similar fashion. So we have methane going up when carbon dioxide goes up. We have both of them going down when the other one goes down. And this makes sense because we know about our ice ages and our warm periods on Earth. So what you're looking at here is an 800,000 year record of the amount of carbon dioxide and the amount of methane in our atmosphere through time. And so if you move all the way to the far right here, the last time we had quite a bit of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere was during our last interglacial period, or our last warm period. And that was about 120,000 years ago. And at that time, we had about 280 or maybe upwards of 300 parts per million molecules of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And a part per million is a little interesting way to say, but basically if you imagine I had 1 million molecules of air in a box, at that time on Earth, 280 of those molecules were carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is not in great amounts. It's very small amounts, but it's a very important greenhouse gas, meaning that the more carbon dioxide you have and the more methane you have in the atmosphere, they're both greenhouse gases, the warmer the climate on the planet will be. And you can actually see that. So if you go from the blue line on top down to the black line during that last interglacial period, you see that the temperature difference or the temperature change over Antarctica during that period where both the methane and the carbon dioxide levels were high, you see that it was much warmer over Antarctica. So we've known that the more carbon dioxide you have in the atmosphere, the more methane you have in the atmosphere, the warmer the planet will be. So the fact that we're putting more of these gases into our atmosphere every single day is very concerning for climate scientists because we know what's going to happen. And we're actually seeing it already. But anyway, so these are our ice core records of greenhouse gases. And these are really critical because we wouldn't know what the atmosphere looked like, how much carbon dioxide there was in the atmosphere without these records. So these are the only records of what was in our atmosphere through time. So ice cores are really important. So just quickly, the largest rise in greenhouse gases has occurred since the Industrial Revolution. So I'm going to toggle back here really quickly. So you'll see pretty much carbon dioxide levels ranged from about 180 parts per million, the blue line, upwards of 300 parts per million, right? Now, if we look at this line, sorry, the color's changed. Carbon dioxide is now the red curve. But now we see that the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is well over that 300 parts per million threshold that we had observed in the ice core level, in the ice core record. Actually, today, the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, I just checked before I started recording this, is about 414 parts per million. So where that star is on the top right of this plot, we are seeing levels today in the atmosphere that we've never seen that we don't see it in the ice core records that span the last 800,000 years. So, you can figure out what that means for yourself. So at UC Irvine, we were interested in what we call trace gases. So these gases are much less abundant than the carbon dioxide or the methane. So we're looking at gases that are in the atmosphere in the order of part per trillion level. So imagine I have a box and I have 1 trillion molecules of air. I'm looking at gases that have only maybe 10 to 100 molecules per trillion molecules of air. So we're looking at very tiny amounts of these gases through time. And why would we be interested in gases that are in such low levels in our atmosphere? And that's because they can inform us about different cycles on our Earth. Okay, so for me, my research was really focused on these large-scale wildfires, or what scientists call biomass burning. So different gases, for example, acetylene. Acetylene has the chemical formula of C2H2. So there's two carbons with two hydrogens, and there's triply bonded between the carbons there. Anyways, acetylene is released from fires. So if I have a record of the amount of acetylene from an ice core record, so I have acetylene through time, I can get a sense of how much wildfires there were through time. And then I can compare it to what we know about wildfires today. So that's kind of what I did for my dissertation research. Also at UC Irvine, we were focused on photosynthesis. So how many plants were there through time? Like, we kind of think we know the answer to that, like when it's colder and probably don't have as many plants, but we still don't necessarily know how photosynthesis may change in a warming climate. So these are some of the gases we were interested in to try to answer those questions. So how do we get the air out of the ice? So this is a really fun experiment that I like to lead people on. So I tell you, you have 1 second to get a $5 bill out of a piece of ice. What are you going to do? Everyone says, drop it, break it. Yep, that's pretty much what we do with ice core research. So we have two main methods of extraction, or getting that air out of the ice. The first being dry extraction. So what we do is we have a chamber that has kind of like a cheese grater blade on it, and we put our ice core sample in there, and that chamber moves back and forth, and the ice shreds or breaks apart inside the chamber, and all of the air bubbles can come out. And then what my research focused on was what we call wet extraction. And this is pretty simply, we just melt the ice. And so when you melt the ice, the air bubbles come out, and then you can take that sample of air and measure it for the amount of, say, example, acetylene or methane, carbon dioxide, whatever gases you're interested in. And so that was my research. So my research question was, how have natural wildfires changed in the past? And what are the relationships between temperature and precipitation? So most people think, well, if it's hotter, you're going to get more fire. That's true to an extent, but in the years leading up to that warmer period, it must have been, you needed to have cooler, wetter conditions in order to grow things to begin with. So there's this really fine line, this balance between the climate system in order to get fires. So what I did is I studied two gases. I'm only showing you one gas here, but I studied ethane and acetylene. So I measured the amount of these compounds in those ice core samples, and I used it to get a sense of what the wildfire activity was doing through time. And I'm more than happy to go into a presentation that's really focused on my research if anybody's interested in that. So just tell me in a comment that you want to hear more about that, because I actually have several presentations specifically about the research, but I won't go into too much here. So for the last part of this quick presentation, I just want to talk to you a little bit about what it's like to live in Antarctica. So the US has 3 research stations in Antarctica that are manned all year long. So the 3 stations here, number 1 on the top left is Palmer Station. That station is the one that has all the penguins. So if you've seen pictures of penguins, it's more likely than not to have come from Palmer Station. The second station is number 2, the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, named after 2 explorers that explored the South Pole. And then the third station is McMurdo Station, which is on the coast. And so, how do you get to Antarctica? Well, there's 2 ways. The first way is by airplane, which is the way I did it. And the second way is by airplane and ship. So if you're headed towards Palmer Station, you actually depart out of Punta Arenas, Chile, and you take the ship down to Palmer Station. But I flew. So I actually flew from LAX to Sydney, Australia. That's about a 14-hour flight. And then from Sydney, Australia, I flew to Christchurch, New Zealand, which is another 3-hour flight. And both of those flights are on regular commercial airplanes. So nothing extraordinary, we're flying economy or coach. From Christchurch, New Zealand to McMurdo Station, we actually fly the US Air Force or the Air National Guard. And that's fine because you're on a military plane. That flight can take anywhere from 5 to 8 hours, depending on which aircraft you're on, because, certain planes can only fly so fast. From McMurdo Station to get to South Pole Station, it's only about a 3-hour flight, but it just depends on weather. So it's not easy to land an airplane in Antarctica because weather can change really quickly. So all in all, it took about 5 full days of travel the first time around to get from LA or Irvine area to South Pole Station. So a very, very long trip. Before you get to Antarctica, while you're in Christchurch, New Zealand at the US Antarctic Program's facility there, you are geared up with extreme cold weather gear. So the temperature in Antarctica can range depending on where you are, but at South Pole, some days it was like minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and some days it was minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So you have to have the right gear to wear. So here I am in my Canadian Goose parka. I love that thing. It also weighed about 15 pounds. I mean, it was a huge jacket. And then you get boots and all types of stuff because, you have to be safe. Nobody wants to get injured or hypothermia or frostbite or anything like that. So want to make sure everyone is well warm down there. So headed to Antarctica, we're leaving on the U.S. Air Force plane. This is a C-17. What's really fun about flying on these planes is you fly with the cargo. So we got to see our ice core drill there on the bottom right in the wooden box. So our ice core was there. Our ice core drill was there. So we knew it was making its way to Antarctica with us. Once you're in McMurdo, so these pictures here are from McMurdo Station, you get on the C-130 Hercules plane, which are skied planes, which means you don't really have brakes. So you just land on the ice sheet and you kind of coast to a stop. So this is a fun flight. These flights are not very well insulated, and they also are very loud. So you have to wear earplugs the whole time because otherwise you'll have hearing damage. But anyway, so made it to South Pole, so fun. Here's an aerial view of the South Pole runway. This is not my photo, and I'm sad to say I don't know whose photo this is. But you can see there's kind of a cleared area there. That's the South Pole runway. And then on the right top part, you can see a cluster of buildings. That's actually the South Pole Station. So here, what is it like to live at the station? Well, the station is kept at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So when I was inside, most times I was wearing like t-shirts and pants or sometimes shorts, depending on what activity I was participating in. But then outside, of course, you're wearing many, many layers of clothing. The South Pole Station is at about a physical elevation of 9,900 feet. So you're quite high up in the atmosphere, which if any of you have ever gone hiking and gone up a mountain or even just driven up a mountain road, your ears pop. That's because the density and the pressure of the atmosphere decreases as you go up in the atmosphere. And so that means the amount of oxygen, the density of the molecules of oxygen is also lower. So it's harder to breathe when you're at higher elevation. And so that's something that we had to acclimate to. Everybody has their own bedroom. This is a typical bedroom, not mine. This is a Jeffrey Donefeld picture. I Googled this, I'm pretty sure, because I didn't have the technology to take a picture of my room like this person did. But anyway, you're not living in posh quarters or anything fancy, but you have a bed, a small desk, and a closet. We shared bathrooms on the hallway, and we also had a shared, kitchen or a galley. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. What was really great about South Pole Station is they have a greenhouse. And the reason they have a greenhouse is that during the winter time, so from February to October, so right about now, the South Pole Station is isolated from anybody coming in or out. That's because the temperatures get so low there that the jet fuel on the airplanes could freeze. And so nobody comes in or out. And so the only way for the people that are there right now at South Pole Station to get fresh fruit or veggies, mostly veggies, fruit's kind of hard to grow, is to have it grown in a greenhouse. So all of the greenhouse plants are grown hydroponically because soil is prohibited in Antarctica based on the Antarctic Treaty. You don't want to bring anything that's not native to Antarctica, because we want to keep it in its pristine shape. And so while I was there, they had the greenhouse working and up and running. And so every few weeks we'd have a South Pole salad, which is basically just a salad grown with the greens from the greenhouse. That's pretty cool. So here is a screenshot of what our weather was like at South Pole. So every day in the cafeteria area, or what's called the galley, there were screens that would show us what the weather was like. So on this day, on January 28th, the temperature outside was minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill was minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So very, very cold. So yeah, cold is one thing. The other thing that many people don't know is that we didn't have a lot of internet there. So at South Pole, the only way to really get internet is through satellite coverage. So you have to have a satellite fly overhead. And because you're at the bottom of the Earth, not many satellites go over Antarctica because nobody really lives there, and there's no point in having a satellite go across a place that no one really lives. And so you can see in the bottom picture, anytime that those plots were green was when we had internet. So for most of the day, we didn't have internet. And even when we did have internet, the first priority went to science and getting the science data out. So needless to say, I was not on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat or any of those apps, TikTok. To be fair, TikTok didn't really exist when I was down in South Pole. But anyway, so not a lot of internet. Some of the fun things that happened when I was at South Pole was that we actually had Thanksgiving dinner. So you can see there's someone drew a turkey in its big red Canadian goose parka, so that's pretty cute. And they go all out for Thanksgiving meals. It's a full buffet because you want to keep everybody in good spirits, because it's pretty hard emotionally to be away from your family and friends and loved ones during the holidays. So I actually was there. I celebrated Thanksgiving there, and Christmas, and my birthday, New Year's Day. So I was there for quite a long time. So on the left was my first year's Thanksgiving meal, and on the right is my second year's Thanksgiving meal. So one thing that everybody really thought was great when I got back from Antarctica was my story about how much food I ate. So when you're in really cold environments, your body needs a lot of energy to stay warm. Just like when you're cold, you turn on the heat. In order to keep your body warm, you have to eat calories. And so they estimate that for somebody that's working outside at the South Pole for like an 8-hour day, you need between 5,000 to 7,000 calories a day. So for reference, a normal adult usually eats about, or should eat about 2,000 calories a day. So we're looking at 3 to 4 times the amount of food consumption per day. So the way you get calories is by eating maybe not so healthy food. So I ate a lot of Snickers bars and Three Musketeers bars, and there's lots of Cliff bars and Luna bars and Oreos and Chips Ahoy and Tim Tams and like all types of food that, to be honest, I don't really eat anymore, because after 3 months of having to eat that stuff all the time to stay warm, it kind of got annoying. But I'll let you know that I still love Tim Tams. So if anybody wants to send me some Tim Tams, I'll give you my address. Here are some fun things that happened while I was down in Antarctica. So, like I said, I celebrated my birthday. So there's a picture of me on the left. The baker made me a cookie cake, and just some of our group pictures of our ice core drilling team out and about. One of the things that happens while you're waiting for the ice core drilling to happen is, well, there's a lot of waiting. So I read a lot of books. So you can see me down on the bottom right. I'm reading a book. And the white stuff behind me is actually snow. So we're actually in a pit that's about 5 feet or so below the snow surface. So it's really cold in there, but I just didn't want to, I guess, go into the heated room. I just wanted to sit outside. But some of our transportation while we're down there is much different than transportation that you're used to back here in the States on regular roads. So here are all the different types of vehicles we drive on the ice sheet. And there on the bottom right, it's called the People Mover. You can see I'm standing by the tire there. I'm about 5'7". So that's a huge machine that moves people from the ice runway into the McMurdo Station area. Because, we have not thousands, but hundreds and up to thousands of people that are coming and going during the season. So you got to move people in and out of the station efficiently. So why did I go to the South Pole? I didn't go just to have fun. So I went as part of the South Pole Ice Core project, which has been abbreviated as SPICE. So there's always jokes that I am a Spice Girl. But this ice core, we drilled into the ice sheet. We went about 1,751 meters deep, which is quite deep. So if you multiply by a little over 3 feet per meter, you're looking at almost a mile, if not more, of ice that we pulled up from the ice sheet. So we went very far into the ice sheet. This spans about 50,000, actually turns out to be about 54,000 years of climate records. So we have 54,000 years of what was happening in the atmosphere around South Pole and the whole Antarctica region. And also, the ice at South Pole is very, very cold because it doesn't really warm up too much during the summer there because it's right in the middle of the continent. Those really cold temperatures help preserve those gases and those air bubbles that we're interested in measuring back at UC Irvine. So those are the 3 main reasons why we went to South Pole. So here's our ice core team. The top picture is from our first season. There were 10 of us, 3 scientists, and then 7 engineers and crew for the drill. On the bottom left is another picture taken. This is from the National Science Foundation. You can see I'm standing there vacuuming the ice core. And the reason I'm vacuuming the ice core is because in order to drill into the ice, you have to use a fluid which helps lubricate the drill because ice is very, very tough. And if you don't have something to kind of soften the drilling process or lubricate the drilling process, your drill will get stuck. So we vacuum that drilling fluid off because we want to reuse it and we don't want to send it back to the US when we need it down in the field. And there I am on the right, standing next to an ice core. And yeah, so I'm not sure what else is coming up. So yeah, to ship the ice back to the US, it is quite a feat. It goes very, very far. So all the ice gets put on the Air Force planes. There you see in the bottom middle picture. That ice flies from South Pole to McMurdo Station, where it gets put on a shipping container inside a refrigerated cargo container, like a shipping container. That shipping container goes on the vessel, the ship, all the way up to Port Hueneme, California, which is north of LA. And then that ice gets offloaded onto an 18-wheeler, and that 18-wheeler drives into Colorado area down by Denver to, this also is an outdated slide, the National Science Foundation's Ice Core facility, which is in Lakewood, Colorado, outside of Denver. And that ice gets stored in the main storage freezer there, which is at minus 36 degrees C. So a very long journey home for this ice, but it's critical that the ice stays cold and stays, in one piece, because if it breaks apart from people dropping the boxes or whatever it may be, then that ice becomes pretty useless for us in terms of scientific measurement. So we are very, very, very cautious about making sure that ice stays very cold and is handled properly all the way back to the US. So I'm going to end this slideshow here because I'm also kind of tired of talking. But I hope you learned something. I hope this was useful for people. I really enjoy talking about it. It is very fun to reminisce about my time in Antarctica. And like I said, if you guys have any questions, comments, you want to learn more, just let me know because I'm more than happy to talk about it. The one question I got asked frequently and to this day is, did you see any penguins? And the answer is yes, I did see a penguin. And if you look really closely, you can see the penguin. And I always zoom in because nobody really believes me that was a penguin. That's an emperor penguin. He was standing out on the ice, that sea ice that he's standing on. And he was molting his feathers. And apparently penguins are pretty self-conscious when they molt their feathers. And so they didn't want to be around other penguins. But anyway, I'm going to end this. And so, yeah, I hope you guys are staying healthy. And yeah, talk to you guys later. Bye.